Hi, we are Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn, and I'm here with Steve. What we're going to do today is a topical session. What we normally do is a verse-by-verse study through the Bible. So if you're just listening to these topical sessions, we'd encourage you to look at the main body of what we do, which is Bible study, and we answer questions as we go along. But occasionally we'll do a defense of the faith or just an interesting topical thing. So today what I want to talk about is skepticism. And Steve, I've got a book here from a skeptic. It's probably one of the greatest skeptics, which is a guy named David Hume. And David Hume died in 1776. But he was a little bit of history on him. He was from Scotland. He never went to college, but he was quite prolific writer, was quite educated, self-educated. And he was one of the most profound thinkers that's ever lived. And he said some extremely profound things. And what we'll find, if you're a Christian at all that's out doing evangelism in the slightest, you'll sooner or later bump into skeptics. And skeptics will doubt things. And David Hume is the greatest of the skeptics. He is the king of skepticism. And matter of fact, he has this book here, Inquiries Concerning Human Understanding. And there's one chapter in this book that deals with miracles. And in that 10, 20 pages, that one chapter called Miracles, he has the greatest attack on Christianity that's ever been leveled by the mind of man. And I don't say that lightly. And all the skeptics that are running around today compared to Hume are generally modern mental midgets. And what they're giving you is warmed over, reheated, leftover David Hume. And because Hume had all of these kind of arguments. And so of course, he's been refuted. He was refuted by C.S. Lewis and many others, even in his day. But the arguments are sort of appealing and they taste good to people that don't want to believe. So his skepticism gets drug out. So what I want to deal today is not so much down into the weeds of David Hume, but I will deal with a couple of things. What he deals with is this idea of skepticism and whether it is a good idea. And he spends his book, Inquiry into Human Understanding, and he spends his book laying out his case for being skeptical. And he talks about the things we should doubt. And he'll go through things, for example, saying miracle accounts are from different parts of the world, and can you trust the sources and things like that. But to be a rigorous skeptic, Hume carries it further, because if Hume was anything, he was consistent. He was consistent. And if you're going to be a consistent thinker, you have to think through your positions and seek your own flaws and things like that. So he was very consistent. He was skeptical about everything. For example, one of his illustrations was billiard balls, like pool balls. He even said that if you see one billiard ball going across the table and it strikes a second billiard ball and the second one moves, that we don't even really truly prove that the first one caused the second one to move. All we really know is that we saw the first one move and we saw the second one move, and we may have heard a sound, but he said it could be some law of physics that we don't understand, or it could be some evil wizard, or, and nowadays they'd say somebody under the table with a magnet or things like that, right? So he cast doubt on everything. And what he was trying to do, of course, and he made no bones about what he was ultimately trying to do. He's trying to cast doubt on Christianity. He's trying to cast doubt on religion. And if we can't trust eyewitness accounts, according to Hume, and we can't trust even cause and effect, then he carried his skepticism to its logical conclusion. And so I give him credit for that. If anything, he was logical, and he carried his skepticism to its logical conclusions. Now, Steve, just as a common, everyday person, if I tell you that skepticism, if you're going to be consistent, you have to go to that extent that you can't even really tell cause and effect with billiard balls. What's your first reaction?
My first reaction is to be skeptical of David Hume. I would say that. So what I often see out of these skeptics is they don't apply their skepticism to other areas. Now, you're giving an example there where Hume does it, but these modern skeptics don't, because their goal is to go against Christianity. But I think in a way, he's got a little bit of a circular reasoning going on here that is kind of self-defeating, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly it. Matter of fact, you already passed a class with an A, and you don't have to go take philosophy class. You don't get punished by taking philosophy class, because that's exactly it. He's self-refuting. And I'm going to demonstrate precisely that in just a minute. But just on the surface, what you have with modern skeptics is they're inconsistent. They limit their skepticism because they're never skeptical of skepticism as a process. They always hold skepticism as the good and right way to be. And so they always have limits to their skepticism. They trust their senses. They don't get into the level of skepticism that, for example, Rene Descartes or David Hume or an Immanuel Kant would get into. These were true three-dimensional thinkers that thought through these positions. The modern skeptics use it in a very limited sense, and they'll be skeptical of things Christian because they don't want to believe Christianity, but they won't be skeptical, for example, of science processes. And there's been many physicalists over the world. When I say physicalist, I mean materialist, methodological materialism that is pervasive in science, that is assuming that our senses are good and assuming that the science process can weed out error and things like that. And what they end up being, in effect, is what has been called over the years scientism. Now, I believe in science and I believe physics. I mean, the modern physics and engineering give us all these modern products that make life so easier to live. So hard to deny all of those things. But scientism is a flawed way of thinking that says that all truth comes from science. And there were some philosophers of science that came along and taught what was called logical positivism. And logical positivism just says, if you can't either prove it logically, like a math formula, or you can't do a tabletop experiment on it and measure it, then you can ignore it and forget it because it's not true. Well, there's a little slight problem with that, which is, where is the principle of logical positivism come from? Is that something that you can deduce like a math formula? No. Is it something you do a tabletop experiment on? No. So logical positivism, and hence methodological materialism, and hence scientism, which is what most of the modern skeptics do, is self-refuting simply because their system assumes materialism. It assumes methodological naturalism. It assumes these things, and it doesn't turn its skeptical eye back on its own processes. It assumes a physical world, and it concludes a physical world, which is what C.S. Lewis's criticism of Hume was.
So, Glenn, let me ask you a question. How does one do a scientific experiment on the life of Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great or George Washington, or on any type of things historical? How can you prove through methodology of science historical things?
Well, that's exactly the problem. So you're, again, very insightful. You're seeing the flaws in this. There's huge bodies of things that we would all hold to be valuable, such as learning from history, or things like love. How are you going to measure love like a math formula, or do an empirical experiment on love, or justice, or morality, fundamental things in morality? That's why, from a philosophical system, when logical positivism came along, it didn't take very long for the other philosophers to say, that's ridiculous, and ignore it. So you understand, within philosophy, hardly anything ever really dies. It just, people carry these things out. But logical positivism has been described as dead as dead as anything could be dead in philosophy. So it has been, from a philosophy standpoint, it's dead and gone and long buried. But the modern skeptics that are really just out here trying to attack Christianity, that don't understand the implications, and they don't see their own blindness in turning their skeptical eye back on themselves, they don't see these logical flaws, where the true philosophers that really understood how to think through issues, they saw it real quickly and kind of dismissed it.
Yeah, one reason why I pose that question is that I see some of the modern skeptics that they'll say, well, yes, I'm looking for empirical evidence and scientific, something that can be proven that Jesus Christ actually did exist and that he raised from the dead. And whenever eyewitness accounts are given, they just say, well, yeah, but how do you know that those eyewitness accounts are true? And they just say, I don't believe those eyewitness accounts. So to your point, in other areas of their life, they accept eyewitness accounts of other people that have lived in history, but they don't want to accept it in relation to Jesus Christ because their real goal is that they just don't want to believe.
Exactly. Deep down, they just don't want to believe. So let me pull out Hume again, because I just said a minute ago, and I hold this seriously, David Hume was and is the greatest skeptical thinker that ever lived. And he gave the most rigorous attacks on the Bible and Christianity that's ever been given by the mind of man. And so his book is no slouch. If you're a Christian apologist or a defender of the faith, you really need to go and take the time and go through David Hume, because his attacks are quite strong and quite rigorous, and not simple little easy things that you can just brush off. They pervade our society today. And if you can go to the great ones and learn the flaws in it, then any of the modern mental midgets will be done away with relatively quickly, because they're really just giving you warmed over Hume skepticism. So in his book, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he spends the whole book laying out this process, the entire book, laying out his method of skepticism. The last paragraph in the book, he sums up his entire point by saying this. His entire book, the last paragraph of the book says this: when we run over libraries, again, this is in 1700s language, so kind of hang in there. When we run over libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school of metaphysics, for instance? Let us ask, and he gives two questions. Does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experiential reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So think of what he just said. He said, go down to the library and look at all the books, everything anybody ever wrote. And any book of, when he said divinity, that's what he's talking about, religious stuff, spiritual stuff. Take any religious book at all, or explanation of how things work in the world, metaphysics. And he says, let us ask two questions. Does it contain reasoning on quantity or number? In other words, can you measure it? Can you measure the temperature, pressure, flow, how high it is, how fast it moves? Can you measure it? And Steve, I had an atheist once that asked me a question. He said, what instrument can I use to measure the human soul? So this same question is Hume hundreds of years ago, right? He's saying, if I can't measure it with a number, then I don't have to worry about it. It doesn't exist. Okay. And what you just said a while ago is exactly right. What number do you put on measuring history or justice or love or any of these other things that we hold valuable? So his first question was, can I measure it? Can I do a tabletop experiment on it and measure it? And if the answer is no, then ask the second question. Does it contain any experiential reasoning concerning existence? In other words, can I experience it and tell anything about it? And if the answer is no, then his word was, commit it to the flames, for it's just an illusion. And again, that's the last sentence of his book. And so he summed up his entire skeptical system, the most rigorous skeptical system ever devised by mankind. He sums it up and says, if you can't measure it or you can't experience it, then throw it away, burn it in the fire, because it's just worthless. Now, you just answered it a while ago with the first question.
What also comes to mind is, how do we measure his book? How do we measure the thoughts in his book? Maybe it'd be a more apropos question.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Again, you don't have to go suffer through philosophy class, because you always understand. It's self-refuting. He summed up his entire skeptical system by saying, can you measure it or can you experience it and get a fact of the world from it? And the answer is no. Let's turn it back on himself. His entire book. Can I measure skepticism? No. Can I experience anything from skepticism that gives me a fact about the world? No. Well, then ignore it and burn it in the flames, because again, they're not consistent. They'll say, okay, yeah, I can be skeptical about the panhandler that's or the con man. I can use skeptical techniques to keep me from losing my money to the con man. But that's not what Hume's saying. He's saying any experiential reasoning means you have to be rigorous about it. Pool balls and things like that. You have to put your system to the test. And if we put skepticism to the skeptical test, it fails and it doesn't pass. It's the same as logical positivism. It crashes and burns. His entire system, when measured by itself, not by some Christian apologist, when you measure it by itself, it's self-refuting. So therefore, it's sophistry and illusion. Commit it to the flames, which is how we can sum up David Hume and rigorous skepticism. And the short way of saying it when you're dealing with somebody is, when you're dealing with a skeptic, is what's the limits of your skepticism? And are you skeptical about skepticism? And they never are really skeptical about their own process. They're never really rigorously skeptical like Rene Descartes and David Hume and Immanuel Kant.
And also, from my experience, is that they're just continually skeptical. It doesn't matter what you come up with. They just say deny it, or they say they don't believe it, or they say that I'm not convinced. So it's just a perpetual, never-ending listing of skepticism. So to me, being a skeptic is really easy. You just continue to say, I don't believe it, or I don't think that that's true. You're just a skeptic. So I don't really know how much thought can be attributed to some of these skeptics, because they just take the easy way out with everything. I don't think they necessarily always think things through. Not speaking of Hume here, but like you say, some of the modern day skeptics.
99 out of 100 of the modern skeptics that you bump into are very limited in their skepticism. They're not really skeptics. What they want to do is take the tools of skepticism and apply it to attacking Christianity. And it's exactly what you just said, Steve. They just said, that's not enough evidence for me. And they just keep going. And if you give reasonable answers, then they ignore them and move on to something else. And they're never holding the level of proof that they ask us for. They never hold it to their own beliefs. And so in that sense, they're self-refuting. But nevertheless, we're told in the Bible to give every man an answer and to refute these things, so to tear down the principles that hold men captive. And so we're commanded in Scripture to answer people's questions. So that's what we do. And that's why we're here with things like this.
And Peter also tells us to always be ready to give them an answer.
Yes. So with that, you've suffered through another one of our apologetic topics, and we don't do these all the time. So next time we'll be back into a Bible study, which is really the more valuable things that we do. But we always kind of have fun with these topics on this, thinking through issues. So that's what we do here, is reason through these things. So we trust that you'll be back with us to do important things such as Bible study.
Thank you very much for watching and listening. May God bless you.